Wow. Imagine trying to talk after that. I'm so glad you didn't talk about Carl. That Dr. Whitaker thing leaves me safely outside. First of all, let me introduce you to Miriam. Because without this symbiotic better half or three-quarters, I'm going to go sit down. I want to talk about two things. I want to spend the forenoon talking about you, the person, and the afternoon talking about you, the machine. So I'm going to sit down so I can work at it. Because I've been at this. I don't know quite why. I guess Rusty did it. She started this brochure by saying, I am. And it dawned on me that she'd set up the whole damn day. And I've been waiting for this chance, I suspect, about 10 years. But I've never gotten around to putting it together until I saw her label for today. And it first hit me in terms of Carl Jung. One of my patients, when I was practicing in Atlanta many years ago, brought me an audio tape of Carl Jung being interviewed by the British Broadcasting System on his 80th birthday. And he has this big, sonorous voice. And they said, when did you discover yourself? And he said, oh, that was when I was about 10. One day I just came out of the fog, and I knew I am. So that's where I am. I'm at 80. Actually, I'm at 81, but they don't give you credit for the first year. All this craziness that they were talking about, and that's weird for me to hear, because it doesn't sound like anybody I know. But about 10, 12 years ago, I began thinking about how I got, wherever it is. And I was going to try to trace for you, because I think it may be useful to you. And then I go back to a quote I heard, the only you I know is me. So I'm going to talk about you, but I'm going to talk about me. And if you can take notes or want to take notes, just take notes about what pops into your head about your life in reference to some of the crap that I will be playing around with. And what occurred to me at 3 o'clock this morning in the context of all this, or maybe it was 2, was that the first time I tried to be Mother Teresa was, I think I must have been about 2 and a half. I lived on a dairy farm way up in the Adirondacks near Lake Placid, up this side, 8 miles this side of Canada. And we had cows and pigs and chickens and horses and sheep. And one of the sheep are catatonic. And one of the interesting things is that they frequently refuse to feed their own young. They won't breastfeed. So the system in our family was to bring that lamb that we call the Cosset lamb into the house. And a little wiggly fur with a long tail who slept behind the stove in the kitchen. And it was my job to bottle feed this lamb. And when I got to thinking about where I came from, I got thinking, that's about as good a psychotherapy as I can imagine. Here was this Mother Teresa, 2 and a half, bottle feeding this wiggling mass of ecstasy. The way that tail went during that 10 minutes I sat there holding that bottle was an enamoration of me that, you can't help but be flipped by something that thinks you're so wonderful. So I had the feeling I was captured into this Mother Teresa racket that we're all in by the age of 2.5. By the time I was 3.5, they upped the ante a little more by giving me a wonderful shepherd dog who followed me day and night for the next 10, 12 years and thought I hung the moon. And looking back that way, it dawned on me that's what psychotherapy is about. Somebody you go to and they think you're more wonderful than you think you are. And then it dawned on me, inch by inch, that that's what this is all about. I started this business of workshops about 1947. It's a fair piece back. And about 10 years ago, it dawned on me that I hadn't figured out why in the hell they would ever invite me back. I didn't say the same crap over and over. And then I gradually got to asking people about it, and they would say, well, kind of what Rusty said, you know, or Paul said, for the next 30 days after you go, I'm crazy. My patients say, what the hell's going on with you? And it dawned on me, they think that if I can be this crazy, they can be more crazy than they had been. And then I got to figure, why did I tolerate this over and over and over and over? And Muriel says, you know, you come back from those workshops and you're high. And I know I'm high because I just pick up something to read on the way back on the plane. I'm not exhausted. I spent 2 days and I'm high on the way home. And then it dawned on me what's happening. I become your patient. I get into a transference state in terms of this experience so that I'm just like an ordinary patient. I'm more free associative here than anywhere else. I'm more apt to drop bits of myself that I haven't seen before in an experience like this, where I'm supposed to be showing off, instead of which I do what you do when you're the patient. You expose more of yourself than you thought was there. Going on up the lane in my discovery of this instrument that we use to earn a living, I hope to earn a living, not out of the love of it. I warn you, stay away from dedicated amateurs, because if you love what you're doing, you're apt to be pathologized into believing that this thing the patient sees is really a person instead of just a good act. We can talk about that this afternoon. But in the process of growing up, you know, mothers and fathers, yes, what they do. My mother decided that she would go back and finish up her training as a teacher. And then we had to move off this farm where I'd lived for 13 years to a city so she could get educated. Except she said so I could get educated. And she didn't know that my education included this first 4 years of insanity. And I really think, and I'd like to fight about that with anybody, that I was clinically schizophrenic from 1912, 13 years, 1925 to 1929. Fortunately, there were no psychiatrists in Syracuse when we moved out, so I didn't get that big sign on your forehead. And by the time I'd gotten 10 years older, I'd gotten enough sociopathy so that I was protecting myself from getting in the state hospital, because I understand the food's lousy. But in that 4 years, I was lost in myself I was in the process of believing I didn't belong. One of the things that came to me night before last, when I was lying awake worrying about today, was that I was my own hallucination. And it's fascinating. I've never thought about it before. That's what I mean. That's what I'm giving you guys credit for. I was my own hallucination. And the question of how I found more and more awareness of what this was is a very fascinating thing to struggle with. And I get fragments every once in a while, but I didn't get any, I don't think, until I was, I suppose, 50 or 55 years old. I didn't dare to see this self of mine. And one of them was, and I tell you this with real sincerity, as far as I know it, I still feel brutal, stupid, a country yokel with no background and no real sense of what's going on in the world. And not only that, but I'm very frightened of you city slickers who are going to do us poor old country boys in. And, you know, it's amazing, because I've been around a lot, which hasn't changed that core conviction. Call it delusion? I don't know what you call it. It's a sense of my reality that does not change. Although it's really fascinating and very delightful to have Paul Diamond and Rusty Gottlieb talk about me as though this was somebody I was being, instead of somebody I was just hearing about. The hallucination that I've been living. After I broke out of the psychosis, or I think so, I did a second thing which I think you need to look into your world and see where you did it. I found myself a non-professional therapist. Mine turned out, fortunately for me, to be a co-therapy team. When I started in college in Syracuse in 29, I guess, I locked into a couple of students who had been in my high school class, whom I hadn't known. One was the most brilliant man in the class, and one was the most popular. And I made us into a trio. I don't know quite how I did it. I sort of conned them, I guess, by my dependency. And we had lunch together in the gymnasium lounge, I suppose 3 times a week for about 3 years. And looking back when I got to be 55 or so, it dawned on me, I was one of Harlow's monkeys. I'd been schizophrenic, and I suddenly found 2 other monkeys that I could hang onto the tail. And when you put 3 monkeys like that, or 4, as Harlow did, after they're taken away from their mother at birth, they hold on to each other, and the foursome becomes a mother, a nourishing entity, like group therapy. So that this was my next experience in, I suppose, the same Mother Teresa thing. I was giving to them the kind of adoration that the patients give to you. And it was growthful for them, just like our work is for us. But it was life-saving for me. So I had 3 years of this co-therapy experience. Then I had a funny experience. I was trained in OB-GYN, so that I was surgically oriented when I got out of New York in 1938. I was going to start practice up in Syracuse. And then I fell in love with schizophrenia, sort of accidentally, and I've never gotten over that. But I decided I was going to find out how they got there, so I looked into a child guidance fellowship and spent a year in Louisville playing with little children. and trying to figure out what was going on, while the good old social worker upstairs who was teaching me how to be a therapist was talking to the mama. As far as I can recall, I don't think we had a single father. We men are so hopeless, The clinic knew enough to never invite one of them in. They had important things to do, After all. What's important, Earning money. Not taking care of kids that have trouble. Good Lord, that's a waste of time. But it lucked in to the time when everybody who knew anything about psychiatry was overseas. There was a war going on. This was 1938 until 1945, 1946. So all of a sudden, I was told, after all, if you were trained in surgery and obstetrics and gynecology, obviously you can teach psychiatry. So I was dumped over in the medical school and taught psychiatry. I could almost keep a chapter ahead of them, but I never knew what they wrote about. And then just about the time I was turning my head, they still hadn't come back from overseas, and they gave me this chance to take over a department of psychiatry in Atlanta, which was even crazier. So I spent the next 10 years learning how to be a sociopath. I didn't learn very well. Schizos are very hard to train into sociopathy. They have a weird understanding of how life ought to be. And the fact that life isn't that way, or that there is a way that it really happens, is hard for them to understand. I'm not sure how much they can really make it. Oh, I've got a few that have done pretty well. Anyway, from then on, I was lost in the world of teaching. And if you don't know anything, like I didn't know anything, and then you're supposed to teach it, it makes it very difficult. That wonderful quote that Rusty talked about. I have this sign that I keep thinking I ought to carry around and put on. Anything that's worth knowing can't be taught. And my son, one of the little kids in the family, he's only 48 now. Next year, he'll be grown up. Anyway, he was up at the house once, and I said, I got these wonderful signs somebody sent me, and have you thought of doing that sort of thing in your office? Because it might make your staff get smarter and quicker and more adroit. And you're welcome to take one if you like. He said, you offered me that 6 months ago. I said, oh, did you take one? He said, no, actually, I was the one that sent you the 20. Old age is wonderful. It's a shame you have to wait so long, but it's so great when you get there. Muriel and I have this game of the Alzheimer's champion for the day. The nicest part, each one is convinced that he's winning. God. And it really gets delicious sometimes, I start from the refrigerator to the garbage can, and I get halfway there and I figure out, what in the hell did I come here for? I go back to the refrigerator and open it and look. There's nothing in there that belongs from the garbage can. So I get back to the garbage can, and sometimes it occurs to me then, oh, you were going to go get a book. You weren't going to the garbage can at all. You're just on your way to the other end of the house. So the craziness is still alive. thank heavens. How do you get to be more of who you are? And it seems to me that one of the things that's been so useful to me is a gradually increasing conviction that I'm ridiculous. A kind of a sort of benign cynicism about myself. You know. So it was so nice of Rusty to say I was a white male. I don't know what it means, except I have this wonderful project. I believe men are hopeless, and I'm trying to work out. I think that's probably another one of these things, several years from now, and I get more of it figured out. I'm going to spend some time on trying to talk about that, because I think it's very true. And if you're lucky, you know, you find some woman who wants to have a baby, isn't ready for a pregnancy yet, so she gets married, and then sometimes you can grow him up. But that's a slow take. And if you're not careful, she'll go and have another baby, and then he loses his priority and has to grow up himself. And the problem then is, you know, if he can't get her to defeat his mother, he may have to become an individual all by himself without having anybody to transfer his burden to. How do you get to be more of yourself after you find the readiness to listen to your inner self, to listen to fragments? One of the ones that comes back to me now. When I was teaching the residents in Madison, Wisconsin, where I spent 20 years training we had 40 residents, 10 a year for the 4 years. And we would do these seminars on the family tree. You know, where were the roots and where were the worms and the termites and when did the sap come up and how could you tap it and make it into syrup. And every once in a while, when we would start these, I'd do my own tree, my family tree first, to sort of get things started. I never made it to do that without making a mistake. I would make my mother as a square and my father as a circle and then realize what I'd done, you know. Or I'd forget to add my father on entirely. Weird. And every time, that moment of embarrassment, that moment of intuitive insight, that moment of saying something honest to yourself, and the residents would chuckle. And that would make it more possible for them to be honest. Or we'd get some trainee from Europe, and we'd ask him to do his family tree, and the damn thing would blossom like a huge whole mass of 10, 12 generations, you know, with all the names and all the background. And we would stand there staggering, trying to keep him holding the burden so we didn't have to take it. So the intuitive drops out of your own unconscious, the bits of free association, the bits of symbolic stuff. one of this wonderful group that we have down here, Paul and Rusty are in, and we were talking about the process of psychotherapy, the afternoon thing. And I was blurbing about my concept that the therapist ought to be honest. First, you ought not to just play detective. That doesn't help the patient. You ought to move in the direction you want the patient to go with your own world. And that may give the patient the courage. And you have to learn how to be more and more open. And we got up to lunch, and Muriel said, "Do you realize that your pie's been open all forenoon?" No, I didn't. So openness is one of those things you have to be careful about. Particularly in your world now, you know, where the patient has no confidentiality rights and will tell the preacher and the next door neighbor and her brother the cop about what happened in the last interview. And you better be careful. So don't be too open. You need to be as sociopathic as you can dare to be intuitive or crazy. Because if you aren't able to handle your craziness, your responsibility for what happens will cut your throat. Fortunately, if you get your throat cut, it helps you develop more blood. Anemia is one of the ways of stimulating blood construction. The liver goes to work, but it's kind of slow. And you shouldn't give transfusions to your patients from your own bloodstream. I'm ready to stop. Somebody want to goose me again? We'll start again.
Where do you need to be good?
I'm waiting. One of the sad windows of opportunity that you guys may have access to is the access to dreams. I assume we're all crazy in the night, that in the night we're all schizophrenic. And the problem is whether you dare to look at your own schizophrenia. I assume that I was so scared by my 4 years in high school that I don't want to look at that schizophrenia in myself anymore. So I don't remember my dreams. If you do remember your dreams, or if you can tease yourself into it, write them down and save them for 5 years. And then when you go back over them, you see more of yourself in a funny way, in those strange words and pictures. During the night when you were a cockroach, you then woke up and thought he was a person. I just had another thought. This process, this dialectic of be as crazy as you can, but be sure you're sociopathic enough so you don't destroy yourself with your own craziness. It occurred to me that that's really what the ultimate intimacy of marriage is about. That you're so close that your craziness is exposed all over the place, more and more and more. And you're so vulnerable that you have to be manipulating of each other because you can't stand the kind of intimacy you want. Nobody can tolerate that. So that you have to be sociopathic. So the combination of being crazy and sociopathic is most activated by the years of marriage, where you're endlessly involved in approaching divorce and approaching remarriage with the same woman or the same man. And that each time you make the move, you're more free to be crazy and more required to be sociopathic. So that weird combination, but there's no out. If you're really all crazy, you've lost. And you're broken. And if you're real all sociopathic, then you're living next door. You know? So it's the same weird dialectic process that you can't get out of. Or individuating and rejoining your family. You know, you go off to college and you feel lonesome and devastated and foreign and available for attack. And you think, God, I got home for Christmas. And then the closer it gets to Christmas, the more panicked you are because you're going to go back to being treated like a 5-year-old again. And you get home and then you're in a panic because it turns out you're treated by a 7-year-old instead of 5. And you live through it or you run off. And then you decide you'll never go back again. And then when you get back to college, you're panicked because it's so damn lonesome. And at least it was comfortable, even though you were treated like a child. So you're trying to get back again for the Easter. And so it goes forever. And if you stay at college and you'll never go back again, you may end up becoming president, you know, but you're awful lonesome. And if you go back home, like any good Lutheran ought to, you end up being enslaved, and you're still staying around in the same place. You're not quite old enough at 42 to leave home yet. So it's a mess. I figure by next year I'll have made it. You know, I'll be happy and comfortable going home and happy and comfortable leaving home. Maybe it'll take another year, maybe 2 years from now.
I would like to have you, if you will, go back and talk some more about guiding patients and, you know, opening up and sharing without giving too much. How do you know how to draw those lines without, if you haven't gone over the edge, have you gone far enough?
Currently, you're into the afternoon, but let's do it. I think you never have to go farther than a quarter of an inch. The only problem is the quarter of an inch has to be real. I think you can say such things to the patient as, you know, I feel confused. I feel as though I've momentarily stopped being your therapist, and I don't have any idea why. And I don't know what to do about it, except I think I'm hired by you. It's my job to be here, so I need to tell you where I am. And for God's sakes, help me. I think it's just that simple. That's one of the things I think Freud left us. There's nothing too unimportant to share. There are a hell of a lot of things that are too important to share. We won't get into those. Does that get some of what you were talking about? And I think it's very important to expose the difference between where they think you are and where you really are. Like saying to them, I'm confused, or saying to them, you know, I'm still hung over from my previous hour. Or if you'll excuse me, I still haven't quite waked up from my second cup of coffee. And if this happens more than once, you ought to try to plan your interview for maybe mid-afternoon when I'm alive, although I might be sleepy then after lunch. Because I think when you get that honest with them, it tempts them to be more honest with you. If you ask them to be more honest with you, then you're deliberately being sociopathic, which makes them more sociopathic. So the problem is how to stay authentic without being stupid. But if you ever work with schizophrenics, that's the prized answer. I love your being crazy, but for God's sake, don't be stupid. You know, I'm go on working with you, but if you get crazy outside and they put you in the state hospital, then I won't be able to see you. And you won't be able to come here, and I'll miss you. But be crazier in here. Maybe you can help me be a little crazier, and then you and I can be crazier together, because one person being crazy is terrible. Two people being crazy is, you know, just don't let me go too far, because, you know, it's against the law. So she has courage. Did you get courage enough to follow? If I cut your throat, I'll give you a Band-Aid.
Yeah, I sense a tension then between a lie and intimacy in that relationship. And and at times I am me with my craziness, and at times I am the therapist with my craziness. And I'm not too sure of which is the line when I get into intimacy.
Very nice. The lie between intimacy and craziness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question so everybody heard.
Yeah, he's saying that he's not sure, this is my way of saying it, whether his lie is the result of his functional role, or whether the lie that he's just heard himself say is a part of his own personhood. And how do you tell the difference? I don't think you can tell the difference, but I think they can know the difference. And if you ask them, and I think with patients that you're really into, you could say, you know, I just discovered I was lying to you. You think I was doing it as a person, or do you think I was just trying to be a better therapist? And boy, will they put their finger on it, you know. It's just like the kids, little kids. Little kids don't know anything yet, they just go ahead and tell the truth. Boy, is it painful and wonderful. I was talking to the house painter at our house. I don't know, maybe it's not that. Who said, you know, my little 4-year-old kid and I were out raking the lawn. And he said, Daddy, why are we here? They were raking the lawn. No, why are we here? It took about 3 times before Pop caught on. He wants to know why we're here. I said, I don't know. We're just stuck with it. We got dropped here by Mother Nature. And the question is how to get out. Or how to make something fun out of it while we're here. I just had another thought. You could say to the patient, I just caught myself lying. Would you lie for me so that we can both be equal? You might tell me that you're still in love with your previous wife. But don't tell her. Because she probably knows it already. We've got about 5 more minutes before 10:15, and then you can all rush out. I was wondering whether we should make a rule that after 15 minutes, the women can take over the men's urinals.
Could you say something again about the problem of loving what you do?
Yes, that's very nice. Thank you. That's a very fascinating business, because I think all of us start out by loving what you do, his question. I think the mistake is if you love it, you then expect to be paid for your devotion. Whether you know that or not doesn't make any difference. The classic example, I think, is the adoptive mother. She adopts somebody, she loves them, and she doesn't know that. She's also enjoying the fact that they're increasingly in debt to her. She doesn't know, but they know that they're living in an increasing base indebtedness. And I think the one thing that therapists can do for an adopted mother is help her get it straight between she and the kid, that she's the number 2 mother. There is a number 1 mother who will remain nameless, or who can be seen, or who... and I always tell the kids, I suppose you assume that your mother was a bad woman and your father was a bad man. But it may be that your mother was the best student in college and your father was the president of the university. You never know about those things. So they get a sense that their biological entity is kept in its proper priority.
What did you learn from therapy?
What did I learn from therapy? Wow. I have no idea. I suppose I've had 6 years, maybe more, of all kinds of psychotherapy, that is deliberate, professional psychotherapy in which I was the patient. And I've often thought seriously about what I got out of it. I really don't know. I spent a good bit of it complaining and fantasying about the sad fact of being a man, wishing I had been born a woman. I spend a lot of it in dead silence, because I think my schizophrenia was simple skits, in which the delusion system was so far underground that I didn't know it, which was one of the lucky breaks for me. So I don't know what I got out of psychotherapy. I think a reverence for the fact that once I was able to take my life in my hands and expose myself in front of somebody else and turn out that I didn't get destroyed. Because I don't think, I guess the simple way to say it is I would never want to be in practice with somebody who hasn't been a patient. Because I think you cannot know yourself in isolation. I think you get only to know yourself by the freedom to be crazy with somebody else. Individual craziness is just isolationism. Two-person craziness is ecstasy, murderousness, suicidal impulses. And that kind of two-person craziness makes it possible to go back to tolerating the isolation of the individuation that we all vacillate in and out of. I grieve that I hadn't gone back for more. For years I carried this fantasy that one of these days I'm going to go see Frieda from Reichmann, whom I got to know professionally, which is the ultimate Jewish mother. God, was she wonderful. And then she up and died on me, which I think was a lousy trick, before I got back there. I think one of the things I discovered, I guess my first interview was over here in Lexington. I'd driven up from Louisville. And of course I'd been in psychiatry for 3 or 4 years, so I knew what it's all about. So I talked for the hour about my mother. At least I knew that much. At the end of the hour, this wonderful old character said in his very quiet voice, "Have you thought about what it means about your father?" And I can remember going down to the middle of town in Lexington, hanging on to a telephone post. I suppose it must have been an hour and a half. What in the hell did he mean? What did I say? What did he think I said? It was like he opened up a whole new world by this simple little additional question in his mind. So that's what you get out of psychotherapy. 5 or 6 interviews later, I learned something else. I said, you know, I've just gotten this invitation to move to Oak Ridge to work on something strange that's going on down there. And so I won't be able to keep on coming back. But if you could see me on Saturday or Sunday, I'll drive up from Knoxville, Tennessee to Lexington, and we could go on. He said, no, I don't work on Saturday or Sunday. And I said, son of a bitch. What a lousy trick, you know. He owes me some responsibility, da 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 da. I had no idea what the words were, but I know what the experience was. It was a long while before it dawned on me. He taught me something about his respect for himself. He was separating the therapeutic job from the person of the therapist in a very incisive and clear-cut manner. And I assumed that was one of my symbolic experiences. And I think we live our lives from one symbolic experience to the next. We have experiences which we make into a change in the computer itself, not just the software. That we add a new dimension to how our hard system works. Okay, first man to the bathroom. I have a special one out here.
We'll take a 15-minute break, and if you have questions, Carl will certainly take them from the audience, but there's a basket in the back of the room if you want to write them and leave them, and then we'll bring them up to the stage. Okay, we'll begin again. Several people have asked if Carl Whitaker would like to sign some books. Some of you will purchase some today and maybe brought some from home. He said he'd be glad to do that. That can be kind of overwhelming if there's a lot. So maybe what we could do is, right at when we break for lunch, if some people want to get their books signed then, and then we'll have lunch and then maybe right before we begin again and kind of break it up. But yes, he'd be glad to sign books. First of all, Carl, I want to say that I have always had ambivalent feelings about your calling men hopeless. Hoping it wasn't true, but believing it sometimes.
No, I wasn't including your husband.
Right. But one of the most validating and not hopeless things I heard you say this morning was you recognized the John problem for women. And that makes me feel not so hopeless about men. Okay. We have many questions, and there are more. Yes?
Only said that because he had his own.
Yeah. Don't bat them all right. There's some wonderful questions here, and we probably won't do all of them, but we'll sure try to mention them. And if you have a burning one, please do raise your hand. Okay. What was your best mistake that you learned from?
Wow. Want to take the rest of the day? The one that's most embarrassing, really, I have set up rules about how to be a therapist for, 40 years, with a mass of people asking questions, which makes rules more and more important. About 2 years ago, I was approached by a man about a problem with his second marriage. And I violated a mass of my rules when he didn't agree to them. I saw him. It was hopeless. I told him so. I reenacted the rules for him. I clarified that he was a systems organizer himself and knew what it was all about. Told him that was necessary and didn't make another appointment. He called back a week later. I made another appointment, thinking to myself, this is inexplicable and inexcusable. I saw him a second time. It was just as hopeless as the first time. 3 weeks, and I refused to see him again, of course. I gradually caught up to myself. 3 weeks later, I suddenly had this flash of insight. My God, this is exactly a duplicate of what I had happened to me 30 years ago when I didn't know anything about the rules and was just doing it out of the, quote, goodness of my heart. Chuckle, chuckle. But that's how massively difficult it is to change. And I guess to simplify it, I believe we're all pathological. I think if we didn't have delusion of grandeur about ourselves, we'd never go into this racket. It's just ridiculous. And the possibility of getting over our own delusion system of being supermom is very difficult. And when you get to be 81, I hope you don't make the same mistake I did.
Because words can be shallow and understanding another person a fantasy, how can a client experience themselves differently with a therapist?
By not using words. Let me go on. About 1951, I tried another one of my endless experiments. I decided I would see patients. I was then on the faculty, so I didn't have to charge. They would not sign their name. I would not know their name. I would not record anything, and I said to each of them, I will be glad to see you, but we will not use words. We will just eyeball each other. I will not say anything, and I would like you to not say anything. For 6 months, that's all we did. I refused to say anything to anybody who came in as a patient. It made no difference in the experience. They went out and made their appointment with the secretary. I never knew their name, address, telephone number, no nothing. But they kept on coming back just as though I'd been going on a careful detective arrangement for insight. I don't know why I stopped. I suppose because I got sick of being a stranger. But that's what I believe about words. I think somebody came from the audience during the interim and said, would you say some more about what you mean by sociopathy? I mean all our normal relationships. They're all sociopathic. I talk to you and you make believe that I see my world just like you see your world, which is an utter lie. I mean, you have one world and I have a different world and we make believe it's the same. That's duplicity. That's a standard sociopathic manipulation. If you don't question my delusions about the world where I see it, I won't question your delusions about the world that you're looking at. That's what I mean by sociopathy. Politics. You know, be careful to write your notes so that nobody can get anything out of them that you don't want exposed. How did I learn that? I went into a hospital in Atlanta on a consultation. I saw the patient and the mother, and I wrote a note on the hospital chart, the mother is crazier than the patient. And I got a call from the lawyer the next day saying, we cannot have that on the chart. You will have to go back and rewrite the chart. I was sociopathic enough to go back and rewrite the chart because I didn't want to be sued for calling the mother, who wasn't the patient and who hadn't been admitted to the hospital, crazy. I was just being inappropriately honest. And as they said to us in the medical school in Atlanta, or in Madison, Wisconsin, don't write anything on the chart. That's important. Because the charts can be subpoenaed and everything you're written. I should have known that. When I was in New York City and being an obstetrician, I taught one of the other residents what I had learned about anesthesia. And he was being the anesthetist and I was being the surgeon. In the middle of the operation, he did something which didn't work right, and the machine exploded, and I was deaf for 2 hours, and the patient died. 2 years later, I was subpoenaed to come to New York City for the trial about this woman's death. And I sat there waiting to be called into court, and they finally came out and said, I'm sorry, we don't need you. We've already had a writing expert who certified that this was not your signature. So you're not being allowed to... I said, well, I wrote it. That's not the problem. The court has decided that that note is not yours, so you may not testify. So I should have learned, you know. I just wasn't a good enough sociopath then. I'm not sure I would be even now. Now I'd probably raise hell and get myself in more trouble.
Why do you suggest waiting 5 years before examining a dream?
Oh, because you may try to figure it out if you do it now. And if you try to figure it out, you may end up just lying to yourself about something that belongs in your guts and not in your head. You got to keep the two separate. Imagine what would have happened if 1936 I tried to figure out why I fell in love with Muriel. I would have ruined the rest of my life. I thought it was a disease. Never recovered. Thank God.
During the break, a crazy thing happened because we let it. But a little harm was done, and this, I think, is people's fear of craziness. If they let it out, it will harm. Please comment.
Yes. If you're going to be crazy, you need to do it in the right way, the right place, with the right person, and be fully responsible for it. It is not something that belongs in the world. It's something that belongs in you and in that intimate you make with somebody, momentary or whatever. My next association is coming around the hall in the clinic building in the medical school in Madison about, 12, 14 years ago. And here was a mother with a little 1-year-old baby. And I was like this. And the baby just put out her arms like this. You know, it was like, here was the ultimate unconditional positive regard. It just flipped me. And here was a perfect stranger, and I had all I could do to keep from hugging the baby. Now I probably would have done it. So you have to be crazy in the right way. And if you get somebody who wants, invite them in, for God's sakes.
I want to tag on to that question because there's craziness and there's craziness which is abusive of special responsibility or trust. I serve a congregation which has had repeated clergy sexual misconduct, and this is a big issue in Cincinnati. Catholic Church is getting used daily. Sexual involvement by clergy and counselor are really confusing. I don't want to be a psychiatrist in my congregation. I want a pastor. But the longer-term members who participated in sexual encounters with previous ministers are angry whenever the subject is raised that this is abusive. They use the consenting adult BS. What kind of craziness is sexual acting out by a therapist, minister, or teacher?
I think the most important thing about sexual acting out is that it does not belong in therapy. A therapist should stay in role. You're on stage acting out a part. It does not belong in your real life. Any actor or actress in Hollywood who wanders down the street making believe they're still on screen is being crazy. Crazy and absurd way. Like the mother or father who thinks that the kid should grow up to do what she wants. I had a wonderful one. My child guy in Louisville was wonderful. This little 6-year-old I was seeing had a coat with 26 buttons down the front. So every hour I would have to spend the last 10 minutes buttoning up this 26 buttons. And her name was Zelita. And I asked the mother as we were going on one day, where did you get the name Zelita? She said, oh, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. So I thought when she grew up to be a ballet dancer, this would be a good name for her to have. You know, how to construct a non-person. How to give birth to something that never gets to be anything. I think the important function about therapy is that it only happens in the office. It only happens in its own specific role. You are not a citizen. You are not a probation officer. You are just a therapist. If you can't be the therapist, if you have to be a citizen, then you ought to clarify the difference and be sure you get out of the stage. God knows the pathology is even worse if you're the therapist, because the therapist has a generation gap. The therapist is a parental. He is an older generation, even if he's chronologically much younger. And that generation gaps make the sexual misbehavior incest, just like it does in the preacher, who is really violating God as well as himself and his patient, or parishioner, or victim, whatever you'll call him, or all three. I think the question of whether you decide to move out of your role, like pastors are so adroit at doing, moving from being a normal participant in birth or death or marriage, moving into the role of being counselor, or moving into the role of being citizen or being politician. You need to be clear that everybody knows, particularly you, but I think everybody else too, knows what role you're in. If you're a supervisor, if you're a coach, don't play on the team. Good old Bateson. And Bateson had it even better. He said, I am a verb. This is one of those wonderful things, this conundrum that you can play with.
Do you want to play with that? I'm a verb?
Yes, I'm into it.
Do you think people become family therapists because they'd rather explore their family's craziness rather than their own? Please explain.
Oh boy, it's certainly true for me. I was there when Murray Bowen did that wonderful first description of detriangulating his own family. And the 15 or 20 of us who were sitting around listening to this, our mouths dropped open. I was the first one to recover it. I said, Murray, I wish you'd been my brother. I'd love to have you do it to my family. But I wouldn't do it to my family, because I think it leaves you outside your own family. But I think everybody who's going to do family therapy ought to take their family with themselves as the victim, the identified patient, to a therapist. I used to offer this to all the residents, that if they wanted to get their family, I would be glad to see them for a free interview. And this one guy called up the same day. He said, listen, how about Monday? I said, sure. And so he brought Mom and Pop and his sister, and we met, and I said to Mother, how the hell did he convince you to come into this kind of dangerous corner where he was in charge and exposing you to this kind of experience? Because most people don't even dare bring it up, say nothing about it, get away with it. She said, you know, he promised he'd cut his hair. How to calm your mother. That's the ultimate sociopathy. If you can calm your mother, you've made it, you know? That was the other person. That's an interesting thing. I had a call from him 4 or 5 years later. He was in Los Angeles. He was a second-year resident. I don't know, maybe he's on the faculty. Anyway, he said, listen, I need another family interview. I think I have AIDS. I said, well, when did you find out? He said, well, I haven't found out, but I'm terrified. I said, what are you calling me for? He said, well, I want to get over the terror. I said, how can you get over the terror if you don't know whether you have it or not? He said, well, I'm afraid of the possibility. I said, well, as soon as you find out you have it, call me back. So about 3 weeks later, he called back and he said, I don't have it. I said, well, thank God. You want to get your family in? He said, I don't know. I said, well, now you can choose. But I appreciate your luck. Don't get in trouble again.
There is a lot of talk today about spiritual issues in therapy. Would you please comment on your thoughts and beliefs about that? Actually, I think you used the word crazy to mean spiritual at times, about being present with the other person and tolerating the craziness and being sociopathic enough to be responsible for the consequence of the outcome. But I would like to know more directly from you without me assuming and guessing.
That's a beautiful question. I don't know. I was seeing a family one afternoon, 5 o'clock. Why I was seeing somebody at 5 o'clock, I don't know, but just part of my craziness. In the middle of the interview, Dad said, out of nowhere, as far as I knew, do you believe in God? And I heard myself say, as though it was somebody else, well, I was brought up to, and I suppose you never get over it. I have no idea what that means. I believe that there is a part of us which is profoundly different than our body or our mind. I play calling it the unconscious. I'm not sure that it has anything to do with it, except another word. I think we live by a part of us that's a hell of a lot more vital than our brain or our body. I guess one of my central orientation to it is a book called Personal Knowledge by Polanyi. It's a wonderful description of what we all know that we don't know we know. It's one of those books you read through and underline and go back and read through and underline some others. It's like my current favorite, which you each ought to get. It's called Finite and Infinite Games. It's by a preacher, by the way, which I didn't realize, and he goes all through the book without mentioning God, which I think is wonderful. I got a theologian up in Chicago who's been set up to write 5 books on the growth of the family by a religious publisher, and asked me if I would write an introduction. And I said, yeah, if you guys can write those 5 books without anthropomorphizing God, I will write one for each of the 5 books. Haven't heard from him since. So I feel like that about spirit. I think it's critical. I think it's the part of us that we don't have awareness of, which is, I suspect, 98% of us, I don't know a word for it. Spiritual has been so contaminated, it's almost as bad as love or sex or something. It's one of those words we've destroyed by making it into an empty symbol. I don't even know how to describe the love between Muriel and me. I know it's a hell of a lot bigger than I am. And I have this eerie feeling, one of these intuitive flashes that hit me some time back. If she dies first, and she better not, or I'll get her, I will not only lose her, my better half, I will lose all of us, which is bigger than either of us. It's the system to which we have each dedicated our individuality, or a huge chunk of it. And it's really an eerie feeling to know how much of me is unknown to me. That's what I was talking to you about. It occurred to me as we were having the break that there was another fragment of that process of trying to become who I am that I didn't say. And I think it's kind of like this spiritual thing we're asking about. I think I was a senior in high school, and my dad and I were coming back in our little pickup truck from wiring another house, which is what he was doing to put me through college. And as we went down the street towards our home there in Syracuse, I caught the eye of a little 3-year-old girl. Now this was what, 5 or 6 doors from where we'd been living for 5 years, 7 years. I've never seen her before. I never saw her again. I have no idea what happened, but it seems very clear to me that that was a symbolic experience that flipped my world. And I have no idea why I think that or what happened. But I think that's the kind of capacity that we're talking about. This structure that makes us live rather than understand or know about or learn about. I don't know. But I have the feeling my world changed when I took a look and I suppose went eyeball to eyeball with this little 3-year-old who was 20 foot away.
Do you touch your patients?
Hell yes. And I haven't learned how to be scared yet. But I grew up in a world that didn't have what you're now struggling with. I don't know how to say it, but there was no harassment when I retired 10 years ago. And there was no incest, 40 years, 1938 to 1982. There was no incest, there was no misbehavior. Everything was going very well. I don't know how all you people got well, anyway, I would talk about your pregnancy. But it really was true, that in the practicing medicine, and of course I came from OB/GYN, so I'd done a lot of patient touching long before I got into psychiatry. And we were very comfortable about touching patients. It was a maternal touching. It wasn't a sexual touching. It wasn't a seductive touching. It wasn't a control touching. It was an activation of the verbal give and take that we'd been spending lots of time on. One of the breaks I think I had in my training was that not knowing anything about psychotherapy, I started in the very beginning working at having somebody with me. So I grew up learning psychotherapy in a 2-parent setting. And I was fortunately in an academic world, so I could always have a second person. And the fact that they were a medical student or a psychiatric trainee or a pre-doc or post-doc in psychology or in social work or in counseling was very lucky for me. But it made the freedom to touch as casual as it felt to me. It isn't casual anymore. Like nothing is casual anymore. If I go down the grocery store and I see a delicious little 3-year-old who's shopping with her mama, I'm more and more hesitant to say hi, because mother may misunderstand. She may think I'm being seductive, and there's another big naughty word for it, but I've forgotten. So you have to be careful. But I think that's what I mean about being equally sociopathic to your capacity to be crazy. That you can be crazy as long as you're adroit enough, political enough, adaptable enough, and responsible enough for what happens. It's tricky. I'm so glad I'm not practicing now. But I think if I were practicing, I would fight like the devil to have a second person in. Here we are, back to the afternoon again. I think the second interview ought to always have somebody else in. Even for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so that you're not in a situation where you're unnecessarily exposing yourself. It's a great racket, but don't get your own throat cut. And you're to blame for that. If it happens, it's not their fault. It's your fault. You're the parent. You're not another child. And if you are, you ought to go see a therapist. You ought to go get help. Or be one of 2-parent family. Raising children by yourself is insane.
Maybe even with somebody else it might be too.
God.
Okay. Can a younger person know his or herself, or does self-knowledge only come with age? If only with age, then what hope is there for the younger, troubled person?
Oh boy, that's nice. I think you can be old by the time you're 5 or 6. You know, some of those people who grew up in the streets of Harlem or the Bronx or Bosnia, God, you know, they're grown up before we even know what's going on. It's a horrible way to grow up. But I think you learn by what happens to you. I just read a paper very recently. Every once in a while I read a paper by somebody who was talking about the fact that young children aren't unlearned yet. They're just as smart by the time they're 1. They have learned how to put together the infinite complexity of our language, our sign systems, how to con mother, how to turn mother against father, how to turn father against mother, how to get your big brother. You know, they aren't stupid, they're brilliant. And what happened to the question?
What hope is there for a younger person then?
Yeah, I think you need to have experiences that get you up to date. You need to get into group therapy where you can see other people making mistakes that you thought you were going to make and haven't made yet. You need to get into individual therapy, or better yet, family therapy, where you can know what you have been hypnotized into and how you can do something about it. You need to find out where you are your mother, where you are your father, where you are your siblings, where you are your first grade teacher, where you are a member of your gang, your peers. And you need to have that experience with somebody who is sophisticated enough to be useful. How do you get it? God, I don't know. You get it by all sorts of ways. By joining the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts when you're 4, 6, 10, 12. Had a resident come in once with a problem he had with treating a homosexual patient. And as was the standard thing then, I went in with the interview. And he was talking about the problem they were having. And I said, you know, I've often wondered about that. I've had this sense that if I could have been homosexual when I was maybe 15 or 14, that I would have had a much fuller life. He said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, well, you know, it's an experience I've never had, and I have the feeling that I missed something. He said, well, what about now? I said, well, it's way too late now. As a good Boy Scout, you know, I probably could have learned a lot about myself. Flipped the poor resident. You know, I thought this was 15, 18 years ago, you know, when the modern understanding hadn't been arrived yet. God, we were dumb then. Are we dumber now or smarter? But I think you can be grown up. And I think the way to grow up is to get with somebody who has been somewhere, find a mentor, or better yet, lock in with a peer so that you both learn at the same rate and from the same state. And it's great for supervision, you know. If you get some supervision with a peer, you can outvote him. And you know how wonderful it is to outvote a supervisor. Makes the day. And I don't think your role has to be age-bound. I remember one of the students in Atlanta came out of the interview and he was telling this story. He said, you know, that's a strange thing. I was seeing this 50-year-old woman. And I said, you know, I feel so stupid. I'm just a medical student, and here I am trying to make believe I know some more about life, and you're old enough to be my mother. That's why I asked you to sit over in the doctor's chair, and I would sit in the patient's chair. She said, Doc, I don't give a damn how old you are. Sit back over there and listen. Well, you know, I just want somebody to listen. I think that your role is not necessity locked into chronology. Little 4-year-olds can be 100 years old. That's one of the things Malone used to talk about. How old I am today. He said, I feel like I'm 104, and this morning I felt like I was 4. What a fast growth. So you stay in the role. It doesn't have to do with chronology.
What do you say to a adopted adult child who says, I was adopted, no big deal, I have no concern about who my birth parents were, etc.?
Well, simple thing is to say, I don't believe it. You're welcome to believe anything you want. I just want you to know what I believe. And I believe that everybody needs a sense of where their genetic background came from. And I don't think you have to do it, of course. And I think it's wonderful to have somebody who loves you, wherever they come from. And I think it's wonderful to enjoy all that love you can get. And it's all right with me if you forget all there is about your background besides what's happened that you can remember. But I just want you to know that for me, you also have a biological mother and father, and they're important. And part of what you are comes from them. And I wouldn't be happy about your making believe that it's unimportant. It may be hopeless, you know. You may never find them. And that doesn't make any difference, you know.
You talked about homesickness and leaving home and returning. How to help a person who's never left home. Example, my sister-in-law is 32, another is 40, and both are home, both living according to parental values, etc. Now, a wedding, a 32-year-old has thrown everybody into a tizzy.
How to grow, huh? You think you're living all your life with your mother and father, and all of a sudden somebody jumps in the middle. I don't think it changes anything. I heard this morning about someone who just had her first baby at 44 or 46. I feel sorry for her. It's a hell of a beating, you know. I can't stand more than half an hour of my 3-year-old granddaughter, who's delicious, but wear me to a frazzle in half a day. So I don't know what you do. I think delayed growth doesn't mean growth can't take place. It's just more complicated. It's going to be hell on Grandma and Grandpa. If you live at home for your first 40 years, your expectations are bilateral. You know, your mother expects you're going to live for the next 40 years. Or she's fed up with the first 40.
What are some of the more experiences, what are some more of the experiences with memorable, no, there's a little asterisk that I'm not reading. What are some of the more memorable experiences with families with whom you have worked with, and how did you change as a result?
Wow. That's another wonderful one. One of them is a delicious experience. Most of them, I think, are with schizophrenics. They're the people who are most intensely human. This was a guy who showed up 25 years ago with a set of red long johns over his head. His brother had brought him from Chicago, and he was crazier than a hoot owl. And he thought his mother was trying to be incestuous with him because she'd come out on the porch where he was sleeping at home on a gossamer gown. And we talked for an hour or so, and then I said I wasn't going to treat him, that I thought he ought to go back to Michigan and finish his PhD in nuclear physics, because he only had 1 more year to go. And that if he got crazy again, to come on back. But I didn't think his craziness now was uncurable. So he went back and finished his PhD, and then he worked for NASA for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And every 6 months or 8 months, he'd go crazy again. And it worked out very well, because as soon as he got crazy, his mother would support him in a psychiatric hospital. And as soon as he got out of the hospital, she would withdraw support again, and he was supposed to earn his living. And then after 4 or 5 times, NASA decided that he was too much for them. Meantime, he and I had and still have really, a kind of friendly companionship. We're writing a book about schizophrenia because he thinks his brother, who's a computer scientist out at Silicon Valley, is schizophrenic, and he can write about it. And if I would write my half, and he's gradually moved into writing poetry. He decided not to go back. He didn't like working as a physicist anymore. So he's been living in libraries for, I don't know, 8 years maybe, 10 years. And he moves around the country. First I'll get a long letter with this wonderful poem with all sorts of neologistic words. And gradually he started looking up the words in Sanskrit dictionaries and one thing or another, so that the poems now have all explanations about what the words mean. And every once in a while we meet. I was visiting a dignitary project out in Los Angeles, and he'd gotten in a private hospital out there, called me up, and I invited him to come over, and we made rounds as two psychiatrists in the crazy ward of the worst patients who came to this Los Angeles Harbor Hospital. And it was good. It worked out very well. I invited him to come back the next day, but he had a bad cold the next day, so he didn't come back. But I've learned a lot about how you can be crazy and live in the world. His mother now died, and he has a maintenance income. He and his brother sold the house and divided. He got along with his mother. He and she were doing very well together. Another one was a family where there were two schizophrenics. The first one was a woman who we worked after 2 or 3 years with all the family, after the days when I would only see schizophrenics with family, because they're too tantalizing and delicious by themselves, but they don't get cured. They just get a transference cure which disappears when they go back home. And then 4 years later, after she got better, another member of the family went catatonic. So we treated Mama and Papa and the adult patient for another couple of years. But each of those has taught me that craziness is something that society says. And it's really questionable. Maybe the rest of us are the ones that are crazy, and they're the ones that are human. We live a double life, and they're integrated. Body, mind, and spirit without the need of public, without the need of another. So I suppose down through the years, the learnings that you get from seeing families with small children, and though they're infinite, I suppose I've seen, 5,000 families maybe. Well, I keep going back to one family where it was just wild, crazy family. And I finally said to the little 8-year-old, what's going on with all these people that you belong to? He says, oh, nobody listens. And I had the feeling, all my wisdom was for nothing. He had put his finger right in the middle. Everybody talks and nobody listens. I guess one of the other things that's important is to ask the question, it's like the previous question. I wouldn't see a family without a father. I will fight to the death to get the father in for the first interview, because he's very busy. And if you haven't, any of you play chess? If you want to learn about families, learn to play chess. The king is so important because he's utterly impotent. And you have to hide him over in the corner, protected by his family and 3 children, before you can even start the game. And you have to be very sure that the queen is never brought out of interplay at all until you got all the kids and everybody else fixed up. You got her religion and her mother and father and her pastor, all lined up on your side. Then you can begin to use her. The standard question from the residents was, "Hey, Carl, I saw a family this morning and I lost them in the first interview." I said, "What happened with mother?" "It's funny you should ask. She and I had a terrible fight." I thought, "Well, they're not going to let you destroy their mother." Good Lord. Low reverence, please. This is fun. I have a feeling I'm not getting much, so it's somebody ought to raise hell.
Why did you become a therapist?
Boy, trying to look for another lamb, I guess. Somebody else would wiggle when I offer to feed him. You're doing very well at it. But that little tail wiggled and better than any of yours. I think I became convinced without even... Here's a spiritual thing for you. I was so amazingly seduced into psychiatry by, I suppose, the first 3 days in that psychiatric hospital where I was having a fellowship while I learned where to practice obstetrics and gynecology in Syracuse. I think I must have intuitively realized that doing deliveries and OB operations for the next 40 years would be ultimate boredom. If you're a carpenter, at least you can make a different kind of house instead of following the old masters who wrote the book on obstetrics saying the most important thing was to get a long cigar and smoke it slowly. Mother Nature will do the work for you. It's like multiple family therapy. If you get 2 or 3 families together, you can just sit there. They'll do the therapy. All you have to do is be the administrator. Yeah.
You talked several times about the rules of therapy, and particularly staying involved, not letting life intrude. Are there some examples of what you've done when you've lusted after a patient, what to actually do with it besides obey the rules? What do you really do when you're sexually overwhelmingly attracted to somebody?
Yep. One of the residents came in one day and he said, I'm having the most terrible time. I'm treating this gal from college. I think she's a sophomore. And she is so turned on to me. I don't know what to do. She's driving me nuts. And I don't think I'm really attracted to her, but I haven't been able to stop her. So I said, well, I'll see you Tuesday. And about the 3rd, 4th Tuesday, he came over for his hour. He said, God, I solved it. I said, what'd you do? He said, I said to her the other day, look, I was talking to my wife about you last night. You were talking to your wife about me, you son of a bitch. And he said, all of a sudden, it was all over. So that's one of the simple ways. Tell on the wife. Better you should get your supervisor to come in on the interview. and tell them about your problem. Because, and this afternoon, we'll get into the rules, there is no such thing as a bad audience. The only error is on stage. So all failure is up to the therapist. No patient fails. The patient just has a lousy experience with the therapist, and the therapist was the one who failed. So it's very complicated, but we'll get at it this afternoon in depth.
I'm afraid the legal system is not keeping complete records, but also realize no one's read anything yet I've written. So thank you for reading this. We've made somebody's day.
That's great.
Okay. What did you learn from the last child you met?
And I guess the last child I met is our grandbaby, who's now 2.5, and who sets the sun up every morning and makes a wonderful sunset. Her latest cliche that goes through our subgroup of our family is, "Baby, do it," or "Go away, Mommy. I'll raise my hell by myself. Go in the other room." That kind of learning is spiritual learning. And maybe that's a way of defining it. The kind of heartwarming, gut-wrenching, diarrhea creating, asthma precipitating things that happen. And she can do it without a moment's hesitation, you know. As she waves goodbye with Mother, "Love you all." And we're in tears. What you get in therapy, you can get fragments of the same thing. I remember so well a family with 3 generations. Grandma and Grandpa had come down from New England, and Mom and Pop were there, and they came in with a new baby. And I spent the first 10 minutes with Grandma and the new baby. You know, I could have seen them twice a week for the rest of the year, you know. I was in. Because I had a pathological co-transference to the baby. So they equaled that. So here we were, locked. We had a family therapeutic system that only took 10 minutes instead of an hour or so. How do you do it? I don't think you do it. It happens to you. I was talking to Rusty this morning about David Keith, one of my senior colleagues, who weren't doing a workshop like this and seeing a family up on stage. And the 3-year-old was sitting in his lap. And she said, "I got to go." He said, "Well, okay, go ahead." So she did. And he went on with the rest of the hour, dripping, you know. See, how can you do that? I don't know. The question is, can you be open enough so that the relationship does it? He was there, and she knew he meant it. And so he had an experience. But you can't create that. You have to be available for it. And if you aren't available for it, you just go on lonely.
I see that the advent of the men's movement, in quotes, hasn't changed your mind about men being hopeless. What would have happened for you to revise your opinion?
Huh? I don't know, you want to take the easy one or have to go all the way? Let's take the easy one. I think men are adapting better, and I think the significant part of that adaptation, I don't believe it's the men's group, although I don't know enough about that to have a judgment. I'm just suspicious. I assume it happens because of the new diaper changing thing in the men's urinals. If a man has courage enough, to play mother at that level, he's going to learn some more about himself and a hell of a lot more about intimacy than he'll ever get by, getting trained like we do. I assume that the body-body contact between a father with his shirt off and the new baby is probably as good as psychotherapy ever gets. Now, it may not be enough, probably isn't, but it's a hell of a lot more than wearing a business suit and earning a big income. I remember my own experience of, I suppose, one of the ultimate intimacies, one of our babies. I don't know which one, we had 6. But it was a hot summer day, and Muriel had gone off shopping, and I'd come home and taken off all my clothes because it was so hot. I was laying down on the floor in the bedroom, and the baby, whichever one it was about, I would guess, a year, maybe a little year and a half, and came over and sat down on my face with a wet diaper. I think that kind of thing opens the possibility of men changing. Let me tell you the other half. When I first brought this up, I don't know, 8, 10 years ago, that men are hopeless, I was talking about that men have lost hope in their early childhood. They have been denied the right to be intimate. They've been forced into being mechanical. It's this wonderful videotape that goes with the Dancing with the Family book, which describes the horror mother has, this grandmother, about the fact that her husband would stay up all night if his tractor coughed, and she could die from tuberculosis and he would never notice. Is part of what I was expressing then. It got picked up by the fact that there was no hope of change. And the more I thought about it, the more I agreed, so I just went on with it. If I talk about it in the way this question was asked, I have to go back to my fantasy. If you go back 100,000 generations in the evolution of humans, when you're in the Stone Age, what kind of man produces the next generation? We're assuming a Darwinian adaptation, those who are best make the next generation, and those who aren't best don't do it. The ones that have the most strength, that are the best killers, and the best athletes are going to escape the saber-toothed tiger, and so they live long enough to reproduce, and the ones who are rapists and have the most children. And you take that adaptation syndrome for 100,000, 200, 500,000 generations, and that's us. So how long will it take to change it? A couple of weeks anyway. Or if you take the other side of that problem, what kind of woman produced the next generation? If you go back to the Stone Age, and there were certain women who made the next generation and certain women who didn't. The ones who did, in my thinking, are the ones who would give their own life to keep their child from getting harmed. So you take that 1,000,000 generations down, and you end up with 93% of the single-parent families are with women. I doubt if the other 7% is men. I suspect that the other 7% are grandmas and next-door neighbors and orphanages. Depressing. But that's the double question. Want to try again? No. Come on down. Yeah. Yep. I think it's tricky. I think you're in a spot that both things are true. You have to be crazy. You should revere your impulses, but you should be very paranoid about your expression of them. So how do you handle your paranoia and your impulses? With great caution. And undoubtedly you run into a lot of accidentals. And you have to judge very carefully, or as carefully as you can, whether this is one that'll work, or whether this is one that's going to get you in trouble. And you should judge it ahead of time if you can. And you need to be kind of cautious because your judgment may not be so good. I have this wonderful story that just tickles me. When I was in Atlanta, we ran the Department of Psychiatry for 10 years, and then we, I don't know whether I got fired or we got kicked out or we dumped them. Anyway, we separated, and we set up a private clinic for 10 years. And then I went to Madison. I got invited to come back to be a faculty member. And the last day or the last week of the 6 weeks visiting professorship I was at, I was supposed to give a lecture. And the title of the lecture was Communication. And I started out by saying, you know, this is so ridiculous. But here are all the faculty of the medical school and part of the university, and the residents I've been training that 6 weeks. And I said, you know, this is ridiculous, asking me to talk about communication. I don't know anything about it. I've never studied it. I'm not sure what it is. But that's what they told me I was to talk about, so I have to do what they said. And it's even crazier here. All you people coming thinking I know something about communication. And you're supposed to sit here and listen and make believe I do. And I wouldn't dare not talk about this subject that I don't want to talk about. And you wouldn't dare get up and leave. At which point, one of the residents whom I've been working with these 6 weeks got up and walked out. And I heard myself say to this accumulated audience of the faculty and their spouses in the university, "Fuck you too." Which was not the way to get invited back, you know. Crazy, crazy stuff. So I think you're very right. You should be frightened, but you should search for moments of spontaneity. Now you could go to a wonderful dinner like we had last night with Rusty and Paul and some others of that group that we've been meeting with for 6 years. And it was a place where you could be crazy and get away with it up to a limit. And we didn't quite go by the limit, I don't think. Haven't heard from it yet, anyway. But that's the way it is. You struggle with it. I saw a couple in Atlanta years ago. He was a great big 6'4" character. And his wife was a very proper lady. And she was always pushing him to be more proper than he knew quite how to be. But they were finally going, this was partway through therapy, and he was getting a little more restive. And they were going to the opening night of the symphony season, or the opera season, I've forgotten. And at the intermission, he was up at the top of the stairs and suddenly threw himself over the down rail and rode all the way down through this with the top hat and tails and all that stuff, which, you know, was pretty crazy, was probably not quite the right place, but it made a great burst in his freedom to be himself. Was kind of rugged on his wife's impulse to be close, because she was about to walk out and never come back. So you have to be careful. One of the great things about seeing families is you can be much more crazy with families than you can with individuals. With individuals, you've got troubles. You're carrying out a role. With the family, you're just the guy who happens to come along. The transference is all between them. And no victimization on that part. Have one more. It's 2 minutes to 12.
Well, I think we'll end right here and invite you to lunch. You will go across the hall, around where the tables are. This is private party dining room. Now, we have structured this as a day with Carl Whitaker. If there are other questions you have, or there are other needs that you would like to be met this afternoon, see one of us, or put something in the basket, and we'll try also to include that this afternoon. So lunch is until 1:30, and there are some museum things you can look at for free, like the gift store. You can't go into the other things without paying. But please enjoy the